Good morning. This is the Board of County Commissioners Board Work Session. It is Thursday, September 7th, 2023. It is 9:05 a.m. This session is set to go until 10 a.m. This is a hybrid meeting. We're at 3000 Pacific Avenue Southeast, room 110 for public virtual attendance. You may follow along on the Thurston County YouTube channel. I'm Carolina Mejia. I'm the chair of the board. I will be in the boardroom shortly. We also have Vice Chair Ty Menser, as well as Commissioner Gary Edwards, and we also have County Manager Ramiro Chavez, as well as Assistant County Manager Robin Campbell. Assistant County Manager Rob Gilder is excused for this meeting. And today, this is a follow-up discussion to the agricultural zoning update briefing. And
Yeah, at this point, I will probably either Maya or Ashley.
Yeah, I can take it away. Yeah, so good morning, everybody. It's great to be back here following our August 23rd briefing. That was the first briefing on the
Can you
agricultural.
introduce yourself?
Oh,
and the
yeah,
title?
sorry. Ashley Rye,
For the record.
Community Planning Manager. So yeah, this is a follow-up to our August 23rd briefing on the agricultural zoning update, which is known as DACA items CPA 16. We are here to respond to questions that we heard at the end of that briefing. Mostly focused on the soil survey, the test out options we kind of broached topic on, as well as the current land conservation incentive programs. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Maya, who will start the presentation. We'll sort of go back and forth covering those different topics, and hopefully we'll have time at the end for a lot of discussion.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Maya Teeple, Senior Planner with Community Planning. As Ashley mentioned, this is a follow-up from your August 23rd briefing, and we'll be giving a short presentation that goes over some of the questions we heard at the last meeting, and then there will be time for more questions, which we expect the commissioners may have today. So the primary purpose of today is to answer questions and the next steps following this briefing and following answering all of the board's questions is to schedule a public hearing and take public testimony on the options that move forward. So one of the questions that we heard at the end of the last briefing on August 23rd from the commissioners were if there were any different themes that we heard in public comments that we've been receiving since the Planning Commission's public hearing. We did do a mail out for the open house that was held in late August, and we have continued to receive written comments in regards to the proposed changes. Most of the themes that we've been hearing are very similar to what we heard at the Planning Commission stage. Some of those are concerns about properties that have very wet soils or wetlands located on them, properties that are primarily forested or currently used for timber production, properties owned by mining operators, and then concerns over the 4S soils and their productivity levels. So the Planning Commission did make some changes to the options, and that is what the board is currently reviewing, but the changes that the Planning Commission made does not address every single one of those things. And wet soils is a perfect example. We've gotten at least 2 individual landowners who have commented about their properties are completely covered in water most of the year. So while the Planning Commission did make changes to address some of that, it hasn't excluded every property that falls into that. And so we continue to hear those things. We do continue to get comments on specific individual properties. Again, this is an update under state law that we're required to do at a county-wide scale. So we really can't go in and nitpick each property. We have to do this review looking at the county holistically. And we have received at least one comment from a landowner who's in support of their property being included. They actually already are within the LTA area and their property proposed for inclusion is just on the border, so it would kind of make consistency across all of their properties. And then one of the new themes we heard is related to possible expansion of a DNR park on one of the inlets. So up near Woodard Bay there, DNR has submitted a comment that they are considering an expansion of that area. It's in the early stages, so they're really just doing kind of feasibility on that expansion, and they have a public hearing later this year. We do exclude public parks from the current designation, but because that area is not it's in the works. It's not already designated as a park. but it could be in the future. So that's just something considering moving forward. Passing to Ashley for this.
Yeah, so let's dive into the more technical pieces. There were a lot of questions about the soil survey. And so I'm just going to provide sort of an overview of the soil survey, what state law indicates we are able to do with that soil survey as it pertains to agricultural resource designations, and how it sort of gets applied on the ground in this process, or was applied on the ground in this process. So the Thurston County Soil Survey was actually published in 1990, and although there have been some minor updates to things like spatial and tabular data or lists of prime farmland soils, it really hasn't changed substantially. It's not like the soils in the county have changed on the ground. We are able to utilize both the list of prime farmland soils as well as what the soil survey calls land capability classification systems to help identify lands that are capable of supporting agriculture. The prime farmland list is defined as land that has the combination of soil properties, growing season, and moisture supply needed to produce sustained high yields of crops in an economic manner. And I think even in addition to what's on the slide, what we've heard from our local NRCS soil specialists are, that soil survey or that list of prime farmland soils includes prime farmland soils if drained and prime farmland soils if irrigated. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take a moment to quote exactly what they've said, because it's really pertinent to the conversation. So what does it mean if a prime farmland soil is only prime if drained? According to NRCS, and this is a quote from actually recent communications that you've seen, ones that should not be considered prime farmland unless they are drained. The drainage requirement is a huge caveat, and one must consider both the legal and practical feasibility of drainage. Areas that include endangered species habitat, wetlands, shorelines, salmon-bearing streams may have serious legal implications if cleared or drained. Additionally, there are swamp buster provisions from the 1985 Farm Bill which prohibit the clearing of wetlands for the purpose of making agriculture possible. Properties with wetlands cleared or drained after 1985 are also ineligible for participation in USDA programs. And sort of the takeaway that was in that communication was that the feasibility of drainage should be considered in the farmland designation process. So that's what NRCS communicated to us for these soils that are considered prime if drained. Similarly, past communications from NRCS for lands that are prime if irrigated, quote, if the soil is prime if irrigated, then that amendment of additional water would allow the soil to be classified as prime farmland. The prime if indicates the unmanipulated natural soil is close, but doesn't meet the requirements for prime farmland, but can be pushed to that if long-term and repeated measures are taken. The reason this is so important is if we go to the next slide, Maya? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Madam Chair?
Yeah. Sorry.
I can't ask you something.
Yeah, I know.
yet. Madam Chair,
Go ahead, sir.
this stuff is so technical. Can we ask questions as this presentation is going along? We're not gonna get through this anyway right now. And as these individual technical issues come up and have other underlying complications, I don't think we're gonna get to asking the right question at the right time to make the board members as educated as need be. So I don't know if I should interrupt or if I can interrupt. If I can't, I'll make notes and see if I can figure it out. But this is pretty technical stuff for me. I don't know about my seatmates, but.
Do you have a question on the current slide right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, what Ashley has been going over, I've got several questions on when it
I have
talks.
questions on the previous slide, so if we're gonna do that, I wanna go back and start over.
Yeah, okay, I would,
Okay.
I would agree with that.
Okay, so then let's start with questions on the USDA soil survey. And so do both of you have questions on this slide?
I had questions on the first slide about public comment themes,
Okay.
but I was holding them.
Okay, so then let's start. Ashley, is that okay?
Yeah, I think whatever works best for the board, getting through the material. It is very technical.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so then let's start with the public comment. Since the planning commission process, and then we'll go from there.
Do you have any?
Well, I was gonna, wait. You had one there. I was gonna wait until you got done, but I'll, whatever.
Okay, well, first, I wanted to ask about the mine owners' properties. What's that all about? What's the issue there? How does that relate to this?
Yeah, and that, we have received written comments as well as, there was a representative from, I think, is it Tenino Sand and Gravel, Maya? I just know where they're located. What's your?
Miles Sand and Gravel, and the issue with that was they have an active mine down there, and so the planning commission made a policy decision to exclude active mines. The basis of that being that they're in process already. They're not conserving that soil on site for future ag use. So it doesn't make sense to designate them now for long-term agriculture. But this specific mine, the active mine part was excluded, and they own some property that is not actively being mined, but on the border of that. So that got pulled in one of the maps, not both of the maps. And we've had conversations with them. It also falls under 4S soil types. So it's less about, it's just not actively being used for mining. We didn't pull out, if a property is just owned by a mine, it still could get pulled in for long-term ag.
So they're arguing that, well, we're gonna mine that, so it really should be considered the same way as the one that we're currently mining?
Maya, if I don't mind comment or jumping in based on the conversations I had with the representative at the open house, that is one piece that they would like to be able to mine it in the future, and they do have long-term intentions of mining it. They also shared that they did have a cattle grazer out there on that property.
Hey, what?
A cattle grazer, they were leasing the land for cattle grazing, and that they were having trouble finding someone to lease it because of the poor quality of the soils or whatnot.
By any chance, did they say why they had poor quality besides
Well,
just the lay of the land?
Yeah, I think looking at the soil survey, those 4S soils are pretty droughty soils and weren't producing enough
Did-
quality hay for
Did
that
they
cattle grazer.
mention that that country will not produce quality usable product without irrigation?
I think the soil survey says that. They didn't specifically say that. I did ask for additional information if they had it on past leases or to provide, more written communication for you all to consider.
And then I guess as a follow-up, I would think that there are no more water rights. I'd like to see somebody have the Department of Ecology come to this briefing and explain the process for a citizen to obtain the water rights needed to put that soil in that upper category. So, because it's almost like you're draining the swamp type thing. It's an impossibility, or nearly an impossibility. So how we can classify something as a certain type of soil when we already know it's impossible to have that soil be productive, that doesn't make any sense. So, okay, that's kind of my question on that.
Okay, and then on forest lands, can you just talk about what the high level issue is when people are commenting about forest lands?
Yeah, it's property that's currently in current use designated forest land in the assessors program. And we knew that there were a lot of the new soils were good for growing timber. And so by pulling out a lot of those soils, they're the 4W soils, a lot of those forested properties were taken off the table and not reflected in the map options, but there's still definitely a lot of forested parcels included. About 1,900 acres in one of the options, and I think it's 1,200 acres in another option, so.
Could I follow up on a question, sir? So why do you take that out of the ag activity? Because isn't tree farming an ag activity?
So they're looking at longer harvest rotations versus your shorter harvest rotations that would generally be.
Granted, 38 years, I think, is the standard now, but,
Yeah.
but why would that matter if it's corn and it's seasonal, 1 year, or if it's ag activity tree farming? I mean, it still gives us that, those acres, if you will, to show that we're paying attention to try and have that long-term or not.
Yeah, I think
So
they,
why?
yeah, I think that the general concern was just the loss of development rights. I mean, from the property owners,
Thank you.
so, yeah, I mean, I think the timber production, is allowed in the LTA zone, so it's not really a concern around whether they'll be able to continue, their
I mean,
forestry practices.
we want trees grown, I mean, that's part of our goal here for the climate situation, I guess, if nothing else, carbon sequestering and all of that type of thing. We're charging corporations for their carbon usage, if you will, and that type of mitigation covers that. So I don't know why we wouldn't include that as an ag activity.
So you said there's 1,900 acres, one proposal, 1,200, like what is the cutoff? Like who's getting in, who's not getting in out of forested land to this? Is it just based on the soil that's underneath?
It's
where
just
they're
the,
growing
it's just the
trees?
soils. Yeah, so we weren't looking at the current use. As Maya mentioned, this has to be sort of a holistic, map exercise across the county. And so we were just looking at soil types.
And between the two proposals that you just made reference to, how do you get from one to the other? It's like you just exclude certain soils?
Oh,
or-
no, it's your two options. One of them has a much higher acreage, like the option that has 7,000 plus acres that you're looking at also has a larger area of forested properties proportion, so
But remind me, how did you get to the higher one?
including 4S soils. So the big difference between your two maps is just whether you include those 4S soils, the prime if irrigated soils, or you don't include the 4S.
Some of
soils.
those include forested areas.
No, I think there's so many different layers that go into creating those mapping options. I mean, the difference is only, I'm just looking now, it's about 500 acres between the two options. But if you look at the number of acres actually between your two options, that's just a small fraction of it. So it's probably just that parcels that, they had small pieces of forested got pulled in. But that's not the biggest difference.
But the criteria for including or not including is pretty consistent.
For the
For the two-
forested
For
or?
the different options for the forested. I mean, I'm trying to drill it down to what is the issue of, like, the forest landowners don't want to be in there at all? Or there's some more technical issue that they like, okay, like you're describing with the 4S soils, that's a very technical issue. And this one's, do we include these irrigated, ones or that have to be irrigated or drained? I mean, trying to figure out what is the field of play with respect to the forest lands.
Yeah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Maya, but I really think it just comes down to, like, they have their property currently in forestry. They don't really see the need for changing the zoning and and that the change in zoning is gonna ultimately result in a loss of development rights. Am I?
That's true for anyone.
It is.
In any category. They're not nitpicking the criteria. They're just saying, exclude all forest land from this. We don't want to lose our development rights.
So the conversation before the planning commission was slightly different because the soils that were listed as 4W were wetter soils where pretty much Doug fir was the primary agricultural crop recommended in the soil survey. And so in terms of thinking about commercially significant agriculture production, if there's only one thing that the soil survey really recommends as being, viable on that soil, that was the basis of the planning commission pulling it out. Not that it was trying to get rid of all of any property that had forestry on it, but that they were really trying to exclude a soil type that wouldn't produce a lot more than just Doug fir.
So 4W was excluded.
4W was excluded by the planning commission, and a lot of those are also 4W is prime if drained. If you can just think 4W, prime if drained, they align very, very closely.
Could I follow up on that, sir? So you said like only Doug fir would grow in that wetter soil, but that's not necessarily true. Cedar really thrives in that type of a soil condition. So, and other, you know, alder and hemlock, they do better than Doug fir. Doug fir thrives better in the drier soils than these other, you know, so I don't get how we could make that definition stick, I guess, if you will.
I think it was more focused on tree production rather than the way this whole survey breaks it up is like the different commodity crops. So there it's, you know, and I'm not a soil scientist, but there's like a whole different section of the soil survey that just focuses on forestry production that probably breaks it down more, you know, more finer grained. For the agriculture component, they kind of roll it all up to, you know, it's better for forestry production versus the other agricultural commodity crops.
You know, that the argument given about they don't wanna lose their development rights, so to speak, Commissioner Menzer rightly pointed out, well, almost any of these designations takes that away. And sometime in the future, a different board or form of government is certainly able to give that back. So I don't know if that's a good enough reason for not doing something, especially when it's being utilized right now. And I know, you know, I'm still aggravated about what the big timber companies did on the whole gopher listing issue. They, you know, so I know it's nothing to do with what we're talking about here, but they took advantage of a situation and forced the problems on the small property owners while the big boys got a free ticket. And I don't think that's fair to our community. So, again, I'm gonna go back, I don't know, ag is ag to me, whether what product they're using or not, or raising or not. So I do have one other quick thing on, you mentioned on the mines to exclude the active mines. What about those applications that have been in before we've started into this whole soil thing? Are they, and now they're being held up, so is that realistic? I mean, why wouldn't they be included as a mine? The only thing's holding them up from the mining is the bureaucratic process of the government and maybe the why. I don't know why, so I can only speculate on that. So,
Right, we didn't pull out permits that are pending. The gist of where the planning commission was going is co-designation is currently allowed. So you can have agriculture and mining co-occurring even on the same property. It doesn't prohibit someone from starting a mine. If they're not already actively moving and digging the soils and the land is then rezoned for ag, they can implement best management practices to preserve those soils on their property. So that was the gist of not looking into pending permits. That would be a little bit more difficult to do, but we could certainly examine that. I think there's like 4 or 5 pending permits. Most of them are expansions, and there's one new one right now. So
I guess when you say more difficult to do, I'm not sure that that ought to be the consideration. Because we're devaluing property, for an example. You know, what would be the mitigation of that devaluing? And I think we stand to be exposed from a liability standpoint if we pick winners and losers. So that's kind of just a concern of mine, so I'll let that end there. I'm good, sir.
I'm good. I'm gonna let this slide go.
You're gonna let this slide go?
Okay, well,
Unless
I'm
you got
not-
more on this.
Yeah,
slide.
I've got some more, Madam Chair. Okay, so I mentioned the 4S soils. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
I just want to do a time check. It is 9:30, and so just want to make commissioners aware that maybe we can get, I'm not sure how many questions, because there's,
I've got a bunch of questions, to be honest with you.
Can we skip to a slide that provides a little bit more background that might help answer the questions about the soils?
Well, I want to make sure that you're recording our questions for a future planning session. That's my concern, that if we don't ask these questions at the appropriate time, they get missed and staff doesn't bring that information back to us at a future planning session. I don't want to lose out on anything here. Madam Chair, do you want me to button her up and be quiet?
So, we'll go through, if you'll write your questions down right now, and then, we'll make sure that those questions that don't get addressed today, right, that another session is set to keep addressing some of the questions. Does that work?
That will work, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think this is the last briefing that you will hear on this item. There's a lot of questions we need to follow up, and it may take a couple additional briefings just to make sure the board has all the questions answered.
And I would just say, there's some topics, not many, but there's some topics where it just can't be handled. I mean, commissioners have to set up private sessions with staff to go through the details. I've already done that. I've already had one session on this topic, and it's not nearly enough. I'm gonna probably have to have another couple more, and I would encourage my seatmates to do the same, because
I've done the same.
it'll take forever if we try to hash it out. you
Yes,
know,
in these meetings.
In these types of work sessions.
I agree.
Yeah, because it's so complex, I don't think it's an expectation for the board to provide direction today.
Thank you.
No.
Yeah, okay.
I think we can skip forward to a few slides. Yeah, we'll stay on this. I'll just cover this really quickly, just so everyone is starting from this same place here. Is it okay if I get up?
Sure.
Okay, it was way easier in the planning commission to do this. So prime farmland soils, just think you've got prime if drained, prime if irrigated. Those are the two big ones to like hold in your mind. Soil survey also has this thing called the land capability classification system. It's a more refined way of looking at that list of prime farmland soils and figuring out the relative capability of them to grow things. And so you've got the major classes, class 1 through 8. Class 1, barely any limitations. Those are the carrot growing soils like Commissioner Edwards likes to reference. Class 2, class 3.
Ashley, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Maya, can you check if Ashley's is picking up by the microphone?
Yes, I can hear her on the Zoom.
I just want to make sure that
Always
we
talk
capture that.
louder. So class 2 and class 3, these have moderate to severe limitations is what the soil survey says, but they're relatively good for growing a range of different agricultural products. Class 4, you didn't even really have, class 4 that's really the batch of the new soils that got added in 2022 to the list of prime farmland soils. They come with very severe limitations. So this is where you really start getting into all your prime if irrigated, prime if drained. After that, there are so many limitations that they really are not capable of producing agricultural products. In addition to the classes, you also have a subclass, and this is just sort of a key for what are the issues, what are the limitations with these soils. So subclass C is erosion. We really don't have any soils that are identified right now as prime farmland that are subject to erosion. We got subclass S, and so this is your stony soils. Think, we heard Spanaway spuds through the planning commission process. They are prone to drought, so these are your prime if irrigated. Subclass W, this is your wet soils. This is the one that's intuitive, W for wet. So water in or on the soil. Our current list of prime farmland soils actually has a lot of W's on it, but they were historically drained. Going back to what NRCS said, these are like your floodplain soils and things that were historically drained for agriculture. They're some of the best soils in the county. If they haven't been drained, though, they wouldn't necessarily be considered prime farmland. Subclass C is this extreme climate. We didn't really see that pop up in the list.
On your class 3 and class 4, what is the difference between severe limitations and very severe limitations? I almost see those as identical restrictions, but try and explain that to me.
I will not be able to explain that in a ton of detail other than just sort of relying on what the soil survey says. Essentially, if you're a class 3, you don't have to amend the soil as much to.
Okay, well then I gotta go back if you can't explain it.
Yeah, well, or I'd have to do additional
Okay, but
research.
I'm looking at some material here, and this is from the 5th of July for the planning commission or something. And for the prime soil, few or no rocks. Well, you've got some of these soils designated as prime, and that's all they are is rocks. So how do you square that? Not only are they all rocks, but they dry out, there's no water, and they may be in a water situation where they're all rocks. So how can you have it both ways? That's, I really need an answer to, 3 and 4, to how to
The
figure
difference
that
between,
out.
so the four, if we could go to the next slide, Maya. So there, the new threes that got added to the list, there's only one that falls in that like S category. Most of those like prime if irrigated, your stony soils, your droughty soils, they are your class 4. So if they're that stony or need that much water amendment, they don't even make it into a class 3. They're already sort of like the soil survey.
But
We've
you're
already
still,
placed them in
you're
that.
categorizing them as, prime soils, and I don't
Well, and our-
understand that.
Well, the USDA is.
I'm not
Yeah.
referring to you, they're being classified, and that's kind of like, as dumb as it gets to me.
So they're only prime if irrigated is
Well, yeah, but you
what
can't
they
get
would say.
water, so that goes back to my question about water rights.
So that is. the
So we're
planning
gonna
commission-
regulate somebody's property to devalue it, so to speak, because it limits their use, obviously. But yet, they cannot, we're basing our argument on a lack of water, but they can't get water. So that can't be the way government does business, in my estimation.
Next slide, Maya. So here's really that breakdown of your 4W, your prime if drained, and your 4S, your prime if irrigated. So the planning commission, they did opt to remove the 4W soils, but then they also recommended including the prime if irrigated, the 4S soils. I would say they based that decision largely on the fact that the public comment that came in pointed to agricultural operations occurring on these soils. They are the prairie soils. It's where we've got our rockstar conservation cattle grazers here in the county. I think, as the other piece of that public comment that was heard is that, yes, you can have cattle grazing on that soil. But is there really anything else you can do on that
Well,
soil?
can you irrigate it in the first place so that cattle can graze? If you can't, it doesn't work. I mean, you might get a month in the spring sometime with some greenery on it until it dries out.
And I think one of the reasons that, we keep saying like, be great to have a public hearing is so that you can hear directly from people who work this land, because I don't work this land. And so I can only reflect to you what we heard through the public hearing process with the planning commission, the comments we've heard. And then also hear from the folks that are, saying that these lands are appropriate for inclusion. But I would rather the board hear directly from those different groups instead of just from staff.
So when you made the point at the last session, I think that the one active farmer on the planning commission voted against this, but my notes also reflect that the agriculture advisory committee, who has a number of active farmers, supported this.
No, they didn't.
Oh, okay. They voted against, or
They didn't have a vote. What they recommended was not considering water. That water, to Commissioner Edwards' point, it's diminishing, it's dynamic, and we have no control over it. And so what they recommended was that water not be considered in the conversation. So if you're gonna look at these soils, the 4S soils, look at them assuming no water and see what they are capable of without water.
Yeah.
And what's the land capability classification system assumes unirrigated. So the prime farmland list is like, well, prime if irrigated, and you're like, well, what does that mean? Well, then you go and you can look at the land capability classification system and see what can you do with these soils without irrigation, and it is limited. without water.
So with this whole idea of, let's just take that idea, Agriculture Advisory Committee said, look at the lands without consideration of water. Is that allowed for us to do? Is that something other jurisdictions are doing? How out of the box is that suggestion, or is that a smart thing for us to do?
I mean, it is within,
Within our
it's
bounds.
within the board's purview to look at it, assuming no water. And the way you do that is by looking at the land capability classification system. If you just look at the long list of prime farmland soils, it's a little bit more difficult, but when you start dialing in to the classification system, you can sort of see the relative productivity of the soils, what they're capable of growing, what they're not capable.
So Ashley, like, was this the recommendation from the Ag Advisory Committee presented to the Planning Commission, and what were those conversations? Like, you know, why wasn't this included in the recommendation of the Planning Commission? What, you know, what didn't make them go to that next step of having that conversation, I guess?
Yeah, so they did have the conversation, that's a great question, and they did look at these soils, assuming no water, at least that was,
The
you know,
planning commission,
the planning commission, we went through sort of a description of all of this. They understood that, you know, the Ag Advisory Committee said, don't consider water. They really struggled with whether water should be considered, and they decided not to consider it. But they also heard during the public hearing that there are existing agricultural operations occurring on these soils without water. And
Can you
so
explain that? Cause I don't understand that.
that if you,
If they don't have water and you got rocky soils, tell me where that might be taking place. They're growing Scotch broom or,
livestock grazing,
well, it doesn't even work for that. In reality, we have to be realistic as we move forward. I mean, if you don't water the ground, you get nothing, except for maybe a month. Well, that's not very much productivity on that particular soil. And you said, we should consider those folks that are using the soil or actually farming it. And I might add that the Ag Committee has a couple of, very small parcel, farmers, if you will, nonetheless farmers, they're growing carrots or whatever they're doing, and they're doing it on good soil as a general rule. And then you've got very few individuals that are actually out there making it work and producing real products to feed, to feed our society. So I think that's why they couldn't come to an agreement on it, and you just can't function if you don't have water rights. And I think some of those bigger operations may have limited water rights, but here we're trying to encourage people to get more ag oriented, grow our own food locally and all that. Well, they can't do it without water. And that's why I ask that maybe we have ecology come in and explain maybe something I don't know. Maybe there's an exemption that, well, if you're gonna grow carrots, you can get so many cubic feet of water.
I mean, I can answer, I have checked in with them. What, without a transfer of water rights from one place to another, there are no additional or new water rights that farmers are going to have access to.
So in other words, it's basically impossible, but yet we've mapped out new areas that we're claiming those are class 4 prime soil when it's not. And so I don't think that's fair to the citizens that expect us to show that we're not losing ag ground to commercial activity or development. And it's not fair to the people that own the property and their property is devalued through some regulatory taking process. And I haven't heard anything about trying to compensate those people under our state constitution that says there will be no taking or damaging, which is very different than the federal constitution. It specifically calls out damaging, which if you look in the dictionary, it's pretty easy to see all the way back into the 1800s, the definition of damaging, when our forefathers put our constitution together, so.
I think it's important that we keep both options on the table if the board chooses to move to a public hearing, because there is a lot of conversation about whether these particular soils should or shouldn't be included. The planning commission had one recommendation, but we heard a lot of feedback on this. And so if I just turn it back over to Maya to sort of walk through again what those two different options are, and what sort of the differences are between
Madam
them.
Chair, could I just make one more real quick comment before we turn that back to Maya?
Okay, very quick because it's 9:45 and
We have a communication that came in today, or last night, it looks like, from a landowner that makes a living on the farm. And I would like to make sure, you asked that they ought to have input. Well, I think they ought to have input as well. I don't know if my seatmates had a chance to read this. This is a very well articulated letter about the situation we're dealing with. And I'd like to make sure it's part of our records, so staff can respond, because I had some questions I wanted to take out of here as well. So I really think that we need to consider this type of communication that came about after the planning commission made some decisions without all the facts. So that's why I think the planning commission does need to hear all the facts. If they had new information to consider, it was not considered, I think we have to make sure that they do consider it. So I'm gonna submit this to you, I guess,
Okay, yeah,
as
we
part
haven't
of the
received
record
it.
or something. I don't know.
Well, you know,
It's from Mr. Schoenbacher. It's not a secret.
yeah, it's already a record since it's been to the commissioner's office.
Well, I want to make darn sure that staff has it because there's
We'll-
issues
we'll-
brought up.
Yeah, we'll make sure we distribute
Okay.
this to Commissioner.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. If you can please pass that along. He was involved in the stakeholder work group early on, so he's been involved since before we ever went to planning commission. But the board does has flexibility to revise these options following a public hearing based on the public comment that we receive. So the maps that you're seeing, it's not that these are one and done. There's the ability to shift these based on the comments that we get from the public. But just recapping the maps real quick, I'm going to try to tie this into this whole prime if irrigated that we're talking about and how that reflects on these two maps to really break it down. The two maps that came out of the Planning Commission process, and again, the Planning Commission did make some changes to arrive at these two maps based on the public comment that they received, only include new parcels that have 75% or more prime farmland soils that are classed as 1 through 3. So those are the most productive prime farmland soils. It's not all prime farmland soils, it's only the most productive, 1 through 3, assuming no irrigation. And then on the next map, also 4S. And those 4S are those stony soils mostly that require irrigation. The Planning Commission did also reduce block size requirements. So how much like area needs to be zoned for ag, and they reduced that to 40 acres. Currently, it sits at 200 and 320 acres for Thurston County. So that's a big shift down, and that resulted in a lot more property being pulled in on these two maps. This first map only includes the highest productivity soils that are 1 through 3. Those are the most productive in the county. There are still some prime if drain and prime if irrigated that fall into that, but it doesn't include those stony soils that require irrigation that you're hearing from in a lot of these public comments, like Mr. Greg Schoenbacher. And the second map really bumps up the number. It's about 7,200 new acres, whereas the last map was 3,000 new acres. And the only difference here between those two maps is that the 4S soils get pulled in, and those are those stony soils that require irrigation. So it results in a lot more properties being pulled in. Between the soils changes and the block size changes, the Planning Commission did not make any other changes to criteria, but we did do some analysis about, what would happen to these maps if we left block size the same, and it reduces it substantially. So if the commissioners wish to consider changing that, we can, of course, bring more information back on that. But aside from block size and soils, those were the two major changes that the Planning Commission landed on in these two maps. And we only have a couple more slides, so maybe we can just breeze through those real quick and then we'll take a list of final questions and next steps. So Ashley, I'll kick it to you here.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of conversation right from the beginning about compensating for lost development rights. I just wanted to provide a quick overview of what the county currently has. And then, of course, we have a docketed item to look at updating these programs and try to make them be more effective for our landowners and agricultural operators. So we've got transfer development rights. That's sort of the open market kind of program. It has not been really effective. We have not seen a lot of purchasing of development rights, even if they've been certified to essentially build higher densities inside our urban areas. We did make sure that when we went out for a grant to update these programs, that we included the city of Tumwater and the city of Olympia in that grant application, and they're going to be a partner at the table as we look at updating those. We also have purchase of development rights. This is what was used in the Nisqually area back in the 90s to purchase the development rights of all of the Nisqually agriculture. It's about 900 acres. And Conservation Futures played an important role in that. Essentially, the commissioners, I'm losing the terminology, but they did use Conservation Futures Fund funds for that purchase. And then you've got your Conservation Futures program currently, which is used to conserve, farmland, but it's very piecemeal, 50, few hundred, acres every year rather than sort of larger scale farmland conservation. So the work on updating all those programs and looking at creative funding mechanisms to support those programs is going to kick off in 2024. We just got the scope of work from the state. And we have assembled a coalition of 7 conservation partners and cities in the region to look at that, or look at all the conservation programs together. And just a few of the funding solutions, that are going to be on the table because they've been part of conversations for a while now, are public-private partnerships, REAP for conservation, something that San Juan County uses. And then also looking at TDR market
Could you
calibration.
explain that? REIT, you said REIT does what?
Um,
Skagit County does what with REIT?
So San Juan County there's a real estate excise tax for conservation in
It's the
addition.
third REIT.
Right,
That's
that's
It's a
it.
third REIT?
Yes, and we've presented that option to the board to, I believe we have to put it on the ballot
Yeah, it's a
to
ballot.
enact it. But you could certainly, if the board should so
Not that option,
choose.
it's a third
And then the
REIT.
money is available to use.
Is it an equal amount as REIT 1 and 2? They're the same
I
amount?
don't think it's
I have
this.
to, I don't think it's a 1/4 of 1%. I'd have to look and see what
It's a little
the
bit less, but
limitation
it
is. I think
requires
it
a
is
voter's
less.
approval. But that's available.
And that's all, like, we intend to hire consultants to run a lot of analysis so that, the board would have it to make decisions, but really just putting everything on the table and then aligning it with the conservation goals. Because we already have 15,000 plus acres in long-term agriculture and property owners that, have been waiting to take advantage of programs that haven't been as effective as we had hoped, that the state and local jurisdictions had hoped.
You just said there's 15,000 currently?
15,000 current acres in long-term
So when
agriculture
we're talking about 3,000 and 7,200, that's an addition.
in addition to those, yeah.
And my question there is what, when you're going through the soil types and you're saying, well, we're including just the prime soils or whatever, but why aren't these prime soils already in the 15,000? Like, what's in the 15,000 if it's not like class 1 soils?
It's class 1 through 3 soils primarily. It's your historically drained.
Okay, so in
that's what
option
the
A, the
soils.
lower option, we're really not adding more soils, we're just reducing the block size, that's the only thing that's adding the 3,000 acres?
There's some soils, well, there's a few layers of that answer. There are some new soils added in
The
that
class
class 1 through 3.
Oh, okay.
They tend to be conglomerates. And what we're also realizing is that those soils that were in our original list, they do exist outside our current LTA zoning. And what we're trying to figure out is how many of those soils exist outside our current zoning that that have been historically drained versus ones that have not been historically drained. And the Woodard Bay property is a good example of that. They have soils from the original 1990 list of prime farmland soils, so they're not in the new soil types necessarily, but they weren't historically drained. And so what NRCS would say is, hey, if they weren't drained, they're not prime, regardless of what the class is, class 1 through 3, if they weren't drained, they shouldn't necessarily be considered prime farmland. So, sorry, I hope I didn't confuse you
that
more.
was- The question, sorry.
Following up on that, so the USDA soil survey, all this, I don't know, probably a couple 100,000 acres of timberland that is in ag, you know, whatever you call long-term ag or what, it's really long-term ag, because they're probably on their third cutting already. And these soils, if the goal here is to increase the soils by acreage on our map to show that we're not losing, why wouldn't we include these prime soils that are currently timber? It can't be, because one of the restrictions is sloughing off, you had
The erosion
the
hazard.
erosion hazard that you said we do not currently have any in there. But if we included this, we'd have a lot of erosion hazard where that timber is being grown, even though the soils might be good. But there's a lot of this area that is in flat river bottom area that is really prime soil conditions. It's probably the best soil you've got. And yet we're not showing that that's ag soil at all. So I don't know how that squares with, if you're trying to increase our acreage, is that part of the goal here?
That's really up to the board. Our goal is, responding to the appeal and the interests of the community and looking at the criteria.
What
But
about the Growth Management Act?
There's
Isn't
no
that,
goal.
it's a requirement here that we do this? Is there no requirement that we add these 3,000 acres or 3,700?
There's a requirement that we update
But we
the
don't
soil
necessarily
survey.
have to add, is that what you're saying?
No, I mean, just echoing what Maya said, depending on how you look at block size and whether you move forward with our current block size or reduce it, the number of
What's
acres,
that block size?
that block size, what is it currently?
Yeah.
200 to 320 acres?
203?
They're 320 acres or 200 acres if it's within a certain distance from another block. And
What
so-
about all these small carrot farmers? I'm gonna refer to them as, I guess. That's not a detrimental term, by the way. I like carrots.
Yeah. Just really quick on your first question, like in terms of the acreage, like depending on what you do with block size, the board could wind up with an option that only has a few hundred acres that are added while still addressing the appeal and adding in those new soil types, or having the new soil survey reflected. So there's no specific goal on acreage. It's really just a set of criteria and guidance on how those criteria are applied that is in state law. And then in terms of the smaller parcels, I think there was an interest from the stakeholder work group as well as the planning commission through the comp plan periodic review to really develop a new agriculture zoning that reflects the kind of small direct to market farming that we're seeing in Thurston County. And that it wouldn't necessarily have to follow along with all of the criteria laid out in state law. So we'd have more flexibility as a community in shaping that to meet local needs.
So what are the block sizes?
There wouldn't be,
As
there
far as-
wouldn't have to
there'd
be
be no
block
size.
sizes.
So it
They
could
would-
be a half-acre plot
Mhm.
for carrots, it'd be ag, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
I'm confused. Commissioner Edwards keeps saying this forest area is the best soil we have, but why isn't it included?
Maya, do you mind commenting on the long-term forestry and how that interplays with long-term ag?
Yeah, so we do have, we have several designations. We also designate for long-term forestry, and most of the soils actually don't overlay with those areas. So it's either protected under long-term forestry or long-term ag. What we're seeing in terms of the forestry that's being pulled in is kind of your rural tree farmers. So they're currently rural residential and they're getting pulled in. If they're not included in these maps, it's likely because of their parcel size or because of the block size requirement. It could be kind of one-off. So otherwise, it might end up being soils. So it's hard to say without like looking at specific areas and why they didn't get included on the maps. But if they're not on here, it's either because they're already protected under the long-term forestry designation or they're not meeting some of the designation criteria that are being considered.
I would like to say that we do have a process in place. If you have your property in the forestry program, you can remove that on your own and divide it up, build houses. You just have to pay a 7-year penalty of what the current tax rate is. So when it comes, it seems like we're really not protecting anything for the long range if that's something that's readily available. And all of this timber program, property here falls within that category. It can be removed. So why wouldn't we want to include that, especially the lowlands? I'm not talking about the highlands where we could have problems with erosion.
I
Lowlands.
just want to, I apologize, Commissioner Edwards. It is 10:01. Does staff have that question down that Commissioner Edwards just asked?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, and
Okay.
we need to schedule another briefing.
Yeah.
I don't think the board is ready to entertain setting a public hearing on this. There's too many questions they have asked. I think another briefing concentrating on that, but also I think it will be good to bring what Future Wise has a role on this one. They appealed, and that's what we're here. The board was responsive to that appeal. I think bringing that back to the next briefing, it will complement the conversation because they did play a role on this as to where we're here. So,
What is it we're trying to get to? I mean, let's say the commissioners understood everything perfectly today. Was it setting a public hearing on, or choosing one of the two options to put to a
Yeah.
what's the next step that we're trying to work up to?
Yeah. The goal is to set a public hearing, and we would recommend having both options be a part of that public hearing because of all of the ongoing conversations and questions from the board, and really just giving you the opportunity to hear directly from stakeholders and people who are directly affected.
So there's no reason we can't set a public hearing, and that'll take time, and we can educate ourselves in the meantime, and then we can continue to debate the public comment and.
Yeah, I mean, I will say if there are timeline considerations, our goal was to try to address this by the end of this calendar year, because it is a comprehensive plan amendment. If we hold too many briefings before the public hearing, giving our timeline crunches, then we're really pushing this off to the end of next year in terms of adoption. But that is the board's choice. I just want you to be aware.
I myself am not even close to moving forward at this point until we get some questions that are answered. Because those questions could actually generate other questions. And so as far as setting a public hearing, I don't think we ought to force ourselves to be in the time crunch that Ashley is laying out. I don't think that's fair to our citizens. So that's where I'm at on the whole thing.
When did this process start?
Last October with the stakeholder work group,
Okay.
but 2021 with the survey.
It's been on the docket since 2021, yeah.
So kind
2020.
of where I'm at, and it is 10:04. This topics is one of those where I'm putting it right with wireless and SMP, right? There's like so much public engagement and public comment that takes place. And a lot of discussions that are extremely heavy. And so, but I kind of want to hear from the public too, right? I kind of want to hear from those that it's affecting, I kind of see what Ashley is saying, right? We need to hear from them. So, because then I think at that point we'll be able to have like discussions on the actual topics of like what, kind of like the SMP, where we were able to have actual conversations after the public hearing, specifically with the comments that were brought by the public. And, we've had multiple SMP briefings since then that, are like 2 hours each. So I'm kind of, let's have one more briefing, and then I think it is time to kind of set a public hearing and hear from the public. And I know commissioners are trying to understand this topic, right? And but I do really think we need to hear from from the public on this, and maybe after that we can have a little bit more guidance or direct questions on how we can actually change the LTC, and that way we can move forward.
Madam Chair,
Yes, sir.
I really would encourage my seatmates to read this letter that came in last night. You talk about questions and to total ask, did the planning commission even see this information before they made a recommendation? And I think that's a big piece of if we're moving forward at the right pace. So I just throw that out. We got more sessions to come, but please take a look at it.
I'll make copies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we will be scheduling a future briefing for this, and we will be coming back, hopefully with more information. I know that I'll be setting some time to meet with Maya and Ashley. I still have several questions that are unanswered, and if commissioners have, just like Commissioner Menser stated earlier, I would encourage my seatmates to really set that time to meet with Ashley and Maya. And maybe then we can be a little bit more concise at the next briefing and kind of make a decision on what we want to do, if we want to move forward, if we're ready to move forward, or if, it needs to be sent back to the planning commission, just some direction to staff. Okay, any questions before we adjourn?
I guess no questions, but I'll submit my questions that were delayed in writing to Ashley, I guess. Is that fine?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. It is 10:08. We are adjourned.